Hello, everybody. Welcome to Cryptids and Critters Paranormal. I'm your host, the Deuster. Today, I want to share with you a story about the Harp brothers. The Harp brothers were the nation's first serial killers, and this is a pretty lengthy little read on this. So I'm gonna break this up into multi parts. Uh, this is gonna be part one. Uh, Part two, maybe part three, will follow a little later on today. So if you will bear with me while I read through this, my throat's a little on the rough side this morning, but I think I can get through it okay. Today when you think of serial killers, a few names naturally come to mind: Richard Speck, John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and maybe even Jack the Ripper. But way before those killers were even thought about, a couple of ruthless barbarians blazed a bloody trail across Kentucky and Tennessee. They were known as the Harps. Micaiah Harp, or Big Harp as he came to be known, was born in the 1760s in North Carolina. His partner in crime, Wiley Harp, also known as Little Harp, was also born in the 1760s in North Carolina and was about 2 years younger than Micaiah. A cloud of mystery surrounds the origins of the Harps, but the general consensus is that they were the sons of two Scottish brothers who immigrated to the New World and settled in Orange County, North Carolina, where they became farmers. Oddly, the Harp families remained loyal to the king up to and after the Revolutionary War. Although they passed themselves off as brothers, Micaiah and Wiley were actually first cousins. And from their physical descriptions, there was no significant family resemblance between them. Micaiah was described as tall, large-framed, with closely cropped black kinky hair that grew low on his forehead, and his skin had an unusually reddish color. Now, Wiley, on the other hand, was described as slender-faced, with dark reddish-colored hair and a smaller frame. Wild and adventurous, Micaiah and Wiley Harp weren't content with a boring farm life. They wanted excitement in their lives, and it seemed the only way they would find it was to go looking for it. Micaiah and Wiley left home as young men and headed out for Virginia with the intention of becoming slave overseers on a large plantation. They never got there. As fate would have it, their plans got changed by way of something big. It was called the American Revolution. While roaming the countryside en route to Virginia, the Harps came into contact with a gang of notorious Tory outlaws and renegade Indians, and quickly joined up. This infamous gang of cutthroats roamed the North Carolina countryside, plundering what they could, burning farmhouses and barns, pillaging livestock and crops, and raping the farmers' daughters and wives. Nothing was sacred to this band of outlaws. They took what they wanted and dared anyone to stop them. Many of them died trying. Later, the British Army took the Tory outlaws and their Cherokee allies into their ranks, which included the Harp brothers. Although it has not been proven, it is stated that they fought at Kings Mountain, the Battle of Blackstocks, and at the Battle of Cowpens, near the border of North and South Carolina. Fighting and killing. It seemed the Harps had finally found something that they really enjoyed. After the British defeat at the Battle of Cowpens and the Battle of Blue Licks in Kentucky, the Harps abandoned the ragtag British Army and joined ranks with their Cherokee Confederates, where they roamed the countryside, killing and plundering to their heart's desire. It is common belief that the Harps took part in the bloody Indian raids on Bluff Station, which would later become Nashville, Tennessee. A short time after the raids on Nashville, the Harps abandoned the Cherokees and broke out on their own, returning to North Carolina to pursue their life of crime. Here they kidnapped a local girl by the name of Maria Davidson, and the following day they kidnapped another girl named Susan Wood. It was during this kidnapping that little Harp was shot and wounded by Susan's father, a Captain James Wood, in an attempt to save his daughter. The Harps took these kidnapped women to be their wives, and despite the cruel treatment and savage beatings that they sometimes received from the Harps, the women remained with them until the very end. The Harps then returned to Tennessee, crossing the rugged Appalachian Mountains and making their way to the Cherokee settlement of Nickajack, near what is now Chattanooga. Along the way, one of their gang members named Moses Doss openly objected to the brutal and cruel treatment being inflicted upon the women. Immediately, the Harps pounced on him and slashed his throat. As he lay dying, the Harps ruthlessly hacked on his body with tomahawks and knives until he drew his last breath. His grossly mutilated body was found a few days later, just outside of the village. Some sources say Doss may have made unwelcome advances toward the women as the reasons he was killed. The Harps and their gang of outlaws remained in the Indian village of Nickajack for several years, and during that time they participated in several more Indian raids against the settlers of Tennessee at Bledsoe's Lick. During their stay at Nickajack, both women had given birth twice, and each time the fathers murdered their babies. In September of 1794, the Harps got word from an impending attack on Nickajack, and the Harps, along with their women and several others, managed to escape before the battle started. Just outside the village, one of the Harp horses went lame, and needing a quick replacement, the Harps waylaid the next traveler along the trail, killing him and taking his horse. Another unlucky soul who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But it just so happens history forgot to record his name. The Harps made their way to East Tennessee and finally wound up in Knoxville, arriving sometime between the summer of 1795 and the spring of 1797. Little Harp married a local girl by the name of Sally Rice, who ironically was the daughter of a local minister. This brought the number of Harp wives up to 3, and even though Wiley and Sally were legally married, it is common knowledge that the 3 women were shared sexually between the Harps. The Harps lived in a cabin near the village of Beaver Creek until late 1798, when one of the neighbors accused the Harps of stealing his horses. The Harps ran off, but the neighbors formed a posse and caught up with them, along with the stolen horses. As the posse made their way back toward Knoxville, the Harps somehow managed to escape. The posse pursued and eventually gave up the chase and went home. That night, the Harps returned and stopped at an inn a few miles west of Knoxville. Inside, they found a man named Johnson, who they suspected of tipping off the neighbors about the horses. They waited until he walked out into the darkness, then followed him outside. The following morning, a young Methodist preacher named William Lamberth was making his rounds and came across the Harps. They robbed him and had every intention of killing him afterwards. But during the robbery, they found out that he was a preacher and decided to let him live and returned his money to him. This is the only known instance where the Harps let a victim live to tell about it. A few days later, Johnson's body was found floating in the shallows of the Holston River. The body had been slit open and disemboweled. The body cavity had been filled with rocks before being sunk in the river. Had not some of the rocks dislodged and fell out of the body, it probably would have never been discovered. It's been suggested that the Harps may have very well invented this method in an attempt to dispose of the bodies of their murder victims, and it would become a Harp trademark. In November of 1798, the Harp men and their 3 wives left East Tennessee and traveled on the wilderness road toward Crab Orchard, Kentucky. Their first victim in Kentucky was a peddler named Peyton. They first befriended him and asked him to accompany them. They seemed harmless enough and were in the company of 3 women, so what could it hurt? He would soon find out. Later that day, the Harps killed him and helped themselves to his goods. They dragged his bloody body into the woods and continued on their way, taking his horse and saddlebags with them. A short time later, they overtook 2 traveling men from Maryland named Paca and Bates. The Harps befriended them and extended an invitation to travel together and share their camp with them, which the 2 strangers graciously accepted. Unwittingly, these 2 strangers were lured into a trap from which they could not escape, and being gentlemen from the East, they were no match for the likes of the Harps. That evening in camp, the Harp men went into the woods, supposedly to gather some firewood, while the strangers warmed themselves by the campfire. The Harps quietly circled up behind them and shot both of them in the back. Bates died instantly, and Paca fell to the ground, seriously wounded. He was bleeding profusely. When he attempted to rise, Big Harp pounced on him, pulled his tomahawk from his belt, raised it high above his head. As Paca lay there begging for his life, Harp brought the tomahawk down with such force it buried deep in his skull. They then took everything the 2 men had, which included gold, silver, and a few continental coins. They then dragged the lifeless bodies deep into the woods and hid them under some brush. Now, somewhere along the trail, the Harp gang met up with a young man traveling alone. His name was Stephen Langford from Virginia, and he was on his way to Crab Orchard, Kentucky, to visit relatives there. On the evening of December 12, 1798, the 6 weary travelers stopped at John Ferris's wayside house, a small inn near the Rock Castle River, where they got room and board for the night. Ferris's Inn was just one of the many that sprang up along the wilderness trail during this period of heavy migration, and were often referred to as wayside inns or halfway houses. They were very convenient places for people to stop and wait for other travelers that were headed in the same direction. The wilderness was a wild and dangerous place, and only a fool would travel alone, especially when there were people such as the Harps out there in the area. Cold, hungry, filthy, tired, and penniless, they must have been a sight to behold, especially the 3 wives who were very much pregnant at the time. Langford must have stuck out like a sore thumb. The next morning, the Harps were invited to breakfast, but they declined, stating they had no more money. Langford then offered to pay for their meal, and they graciously accepted his offer. After a hearty breakfast, Langford committed a breach of frontier etiquette that would end up costing him his life. When it came time to pay for the meal, he produced a handful of silver coins from his pocket, flashing it all for them to see, including the Harps. Shortly thereafter, Langford rode off with the Harps and was never seen alive again. And a few days later, a couple of cattle drovers found Langford's mutilated corpse in the wilderness, where the scent of blood had shied their cattle off Boone's trace and into the woods. Langford's mutilated and disembodied body dismembered body, or what was left of it, was taken back to Ferris's wayside house, where it was identified by his clothing. The innkeeper gave a full description of the Harps to Captain Joseph Ballinger and pointed out their general direction of travel. Ballinger, a well-seasoned Indian fighter, and a band of regulators apprehended the Harp gang just outside Crap Orchard on Christmas Day, 1798. Being grossly outnumbered and taken by surprise, the Harp gang surrendered without a fight and was imprisoned in Stanford, Kentucky. A preliminary hearing held on January 4th found enough evidence for a trial and ordered that the prisoners be taken to the Danville jail and imprisoned to await trial at the April term of district court. On February 8, 1799, Susan Wood gave birth to a son while incarcerated in the Danville jail. Almost 1 month later, on March 7th, Maria Davidson gave birth to a daughter while in jail. With the extra attention to the infants by the jailers, Micaiah and Wiley waited for their chance, and on March 16th, a couple of weeks before their trial was to commence, the Hart men got the break they had been looking for and made their escape, leaving their wives to face justice alone. They also took 2 guns from the guards during this escape. Kentucky Governor James Garrard wasted no time in ordering Ballinger to track down and capture the ruthless Harps. Ballinger and his posse of regulators gave chase, and several days later, they caught up with the Harps in a canebrake near the headwaters of Rolling Fork. It was almost sundown, and some of the posse members were too afraid to attempt a capture. They flatly refused to go into the canebrake until daylight, and in doing so, allowed the Harps to make their escape through the tall cane under cover of night. The posse disbanded and went home. Henry Skaggs, one of the posse members, went to the home of Lieutenant Daniel Trabue, a Revolutionary War veteran who lived nearby, to try to get another posse on the trail of the Harps before they murdered again. Ironically, as Skaggs stood in Trabue's house discussing the Harp situation, Trabue's hound dog came limping into the yard, badly hurt, covered with blood, and worst of all, he was alone. The dog had left the house earlier that morning in the company of Johnny Trabue, the colonel's 13-year-old son, who had been sent to borrow some flour and seed beans from a neighbor just down the road. A search of the area proved futile, and it was not until 2 weeks later that the boy's remains were found in a sinkhole. He was chopped to pieces, dismembered, and badly decomposed. The seed beans were also found in the sinkhole, but the flour was nowhere to be found. In response to the gruesome and needless murder of Johnny Trabue, the governor issued a $300 reward, dead or alive, for the Hart brothers. But before the proclamation could be circulated, additional reports came in that the Harps had committed at least 5 more murders. These included the murder of a man named Stump, who just happened to be fishing on the Barren River about 8 miles south of Bowling Green. Trump noticed the smoke of a small campfire from the opposite bank and assumed another family of settlers had moved into the area. Had he minded his own business, things might have turned out quite differently for him. But Stump was not like that. He grabbed his string of fish and ran to his cabin, where he retrieved his violin and a freshly killed turkey, then proceeded to wade across the stream to welcome his new neighbors. He never stood a chance. As soon as he strolled into their camp, the Harps pounced on him and knocked him to the ground. In true Harp fashion, they slit his throat, hacked him with their tomahawks. Then they slit him open, disemboweled him, and filled his body with stones before throwing him into the river. The other murders aforementioned included a man named Dooley, who was murdered near what is now Edmonton in Metcalfe County, Kentucky. It is also reported that the Harps had murdered 3 men near the mouth of the Saline River as they sat around a campfire. In their race across the state to pursue the Harps, Ballinger and his posse caught and hanged about a dozen criminals along the way. And as word spread of their vigilante actions, a host of outlaws hightailed it out of Kentucky for parts unknown. Probably a good thing in its own right, but it had the posse concentrated solely away from their primary goal, which was the apprehension and capture of the Harps. And they may have succeeded had they not got sidetracked by these other outlaws. It was a very act of dispensing frontier justice along the way that valuable time was lost. Time that would allow the Harps to make their escape along the Ohio River into Illinois, where they holed up at the infamous Cave in the Rock, well out of the jurisdiction of Governor Girard and Ballinger's posse of regulators. Tomorrow I will do part 2 of this. It's quite lengthy. I'll do part 2 of it. I hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe to my channel. Give me a like. Share it with your friends. And once again, this is the Dooster with Cryptids and Critters Paranormal. Thank you for watching.